Hi everyone, welcome. Down here in my wormery, when you see perforated cardboard, you know what time it is. It's migration time. And the systems that are in my sites to be migrated are my now 334-day-old European nightcrawler systems. These systems have been fed 29 times, and I do feed the horizontal migration feeding zone as a typical feeding. However, it's just geared up to achieve a different goal. It's really not about the breakdown of the materials and creation of compost. It's more about, at that point, motivating the worms to gather in a particular location so that I can arrange their haul out and then subsequent harvesting of their castings. So I'm going to put on a glove and we're going to get these systems set up with a horizontal migration in preparation for harvest. So let's get to work. Hopefully this assortment of yummy foods that I've assembled for this is going to be good motivation to get the worms to move out of their finished castings. But I'll be honest, over time, my point of view on what it takes to get the worms to exit their castings has slightly changed. And for a while, I always thought to myself, hey, you let the food supply in their old castings run out, perhaps allowing some time for the systems to go through a period of what I refer to as foraging, allowing the worms to pick off leftovers of what might still be in there over some time, and then initiating a migration of the worms out of the material. But then I think I've kind of started having a little bit of a change of point of view on that, because it has seemed to me in other systems that I'm actually in the process of trying to migrate right now, that the worms don't necessarily come flocking towards a pile of freshly added yummy foods. They seem perfectly content to simply remain in the material that they've been in and just stay there. As long as the moisture level is high and comfortable, they'll not really feel motivated to leave. So that's probably one of the main reasons why the only coverings that you found here were those 2 sheets of newspaper covered by cardboard, hopefully allowing these systems to begin shedding a little bit of their moisture so that at some point they'll find that the material has become dry enough that they would prefer to find something more damp and cozy to be in. So I even thought about maybe not putting those sheets of cardboard back on when we finish here, and possibly allowing these systems to have even more access to the evaporation process by not being covered, and allowing for the drying to happen a little bit more rapidly in these systems. The horizontal migration feeding zone, on the other hand, would be protected from evaporation with some plastic coverings. And I just happen to have a couple pieces of plastic which would fit quite nicely over the feeding zone. So perhaps at the end we'll cover up with newspaper only. After we set up the horizontal migration feeding zones, covering up those areas with plastic only, allowing this rest of the material to just continue drying. I could feel some dryness of the materials out here on the surface. And I gotta be honest, I do see a lot of residual bits of material in here, kind of making me question, you know, what it's going to look like in a few weeks. Is this stuff actually going to break down, or perhaps would it have been better to enter a period of foraging, allowing the worms some time to work through all this residual stuff? Admittedly, what you see out here on the surface is not going to get a great deal of attention, exactly for the reason that you might be guessing, which is the fact that it's been left to get dry. And then they'll be down lower looking for the more moist materials, evading this drier stuff out on the surface. So, you know, I would like to see all this stuff that sort of remains in this as leftover bits of bedding and maybe food to also gradually get broken down. So I don't know. I mean, I do like the idea of getting the migration started, or at least starting the feedings into something that's aligned with getting the worms to exit their castings. So that is what we're going to end up doing here today, but I think the other big piece of allowing a system to dry off is aeration. So we're going to aerate the contents of these systems to try to get the more damp stuff that's down low closer to the surface where it can kick off some of its moisture, maybe, you know, submerging some of the material that's already had a chance to dry over the past 10 days since our last check-in. Get that stuff down lower, possibly, you know, sucking some of the system's moisture into itself, allowing things to level off a little bit. And you know what? I'm almost wondering if bringing more food down here was a mistake. It does seem like perhaps 10 days was not enough to see all this food get consumed. Even though there's a good number of worms down here in this system, they don't seem to have depleted. I don't know. Look how much leftovers we got here. It does seem like they've left quite a bit from the last feeding. I mean, right here you could see 2 pieces of the cantaloupe melon rinds that have been completely stripped of the actual fruit. And here too, a good bit of it has actually been nibbled off, but for whatever reason, some of it has not yet been nibbled off. And there does seem to be a distinct line right there. I'm wondering if maybe it was just kind of resting up against something and blocking access. Not that the worms couldn't have been able to wriggle their way into there and get access if they wanted it, but if there's more easily accessible stuff right there, then why wouldn't they just go for that and then save the more difficult stuff to access for later after the easy to reach stuff has been depleted? So I think one of the key things to running your worm farm is the ability to adapt and be flexible and not get too into the mindset of completing the thing that you wanted to do in the way that you had wanted to do it, because sometimes the worms are going to throw a curveball at you, and then you're going to have to think on your feet and get the check-in completed in some way that, you know, still satisfies your desire to move things in a particular direction, but also at the same time not do anything that's kind of counterintuitive or possibly even going to come back to bite you later or work against you. So, you know, I'm starting to think that possibly the stuff I bought down here for them might be overkill. I mean, maybe it wouldn't hurt just to use it in addition to the leftovers, but I think collecting up the leftovers is going to be a good idea. I did already, during the last feeding, think ahead in terms of what I might be wanting to do one of these days. So the bedding I used was only a couple of very large single pieces of cardboard placed into each of these systems, intended for easy retrieval as a whole piece or as at least a couple pieces instead of having all kinds of tiny fragments of shredded paper and cardboard everywhere. And even the cantaloupe was chosen specifically with the hopes that if I wanted to pick the pieces out that had not yet been eaten yet later, that it would be an easy to do thing if it was a large piece of material. So it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we were able to gather up almost all of the items we placed in here 10 days ago just by picking through the feeding zone and gathering them together, pretty much leaving us with, you know, a bin full of castings and worms with the bedding materials and the food items added last time extracted. And then I think we could just use those possibly in combination with some, maybe all of the stuff I bought down here to assemble the horizontal migration feeding zone. I'll be honest though, the moisture content is what is concerning me a little bit. Because even in the other systems where I'm attempting to migrate the worms, it does seem like the worms just didn't want to budge. They just stayed right there in the damp material. and I pretty much left it uncovered. No paper coverings, obviously no plastic coverings. And in those systems, they're still migrating. Well, one of them still is. And one of them I did actually finally get to the point where the material was crumbly enough and loose enough and dry enough, basically, to see the worms exit it finally and gather over in the horizontal migration feeding zone. But that took over a month and a half. And I'm starting to wonder if the material in this system is also so damp that it'll take possibly a month or more of simple, direct access to the air to dry enough to make it such that the worms might want to try to seek out a more comfortable place to hang out over in the horizontal migration feeding zone that we're going to create for them. So not quite what I expected. I did sort of expect more, I'll admit. When I swapped out the plastic coverings from these systems with only cardboard and paper, I did expect to see possibly a little bit more drying, but I do believe that at this point the best bet is going to be to leave off even the cardboard, maybe even paper, maybe have nothing, maybe just allow the finished castings side of these systems to have direct access to drying and evaporation, so as to get the worms motivated to head over to the horizontal migration feeding zone and out of their finished castings. Now here, this stuff doesn't seem quite as damp or clumpy. You'll notice right away how it does seem to crumble much more readily than the stuff we saw in the other system. And these systems are the same age, fed the same number of times, and all that other fun stuff, so they are always being maintained in a consistent way. And the fact that one of them is more damp than the other just happens, despite your best efforts to keep them in sync to the best of your ability. It is always quite possible that you're going to find one system possibly consisting of material that seems a little bit more manageable than the other. And I was just sort of getting that gut feeling from this system here that that quite possibly the material is perhaps a little bit drier than what's in the other box, and possibly in a position to see the migration of the worms out of the finished castings a little bit more quickly than the other one. But you never know. We might not have seen everything yet, because as we make our way down to the middle of the bin where the most recent feedings have been getting placed, I mean, for that matter, all the feedings have been getting placed down the middle in these two systems. And as I pick through the middle of the bin, it does seem like the moisture level is quite a bit higher. Not too surprising, considering melon was the food they got last time. Melon does have a tendency to expel a certain degree of moisture as it breaks down, although with cantaloupe you wouldn't expect quite as much as maybe a big juicy piece of watermelon, especially when it's basically just the rinds. And these worms are definitely all over this cantaloupe here. They're enjoying it. I mean, they must be enjoying it. Why else would they be gathered around it like so? Oh my goodness, look at all these wormies. So, I don't know, I've just been sort of piling everything up over on that other stack of bedding and food leftovers, kind of keeping everything in one spot so that I can gauge it at the end and divide it up evenly. Maybe one of the bins has burned through more of the leftovers than the other, and I'd really like to just divvy this stuff out evenly when we reset here and set up the horizontal migration feeding zones. And you can see they've really made their way through a lot of this cantaloupe. In this system, I feel like I'm not finding quite as many leftovers. Possibly seeing even more worms, even though both of these systems would have been launched with what I believe to be an equal number of worms in the beginning. There's always that possibility that, one system, for whatever reason, will have a tendency to build up its population more than the other. Yeah, the worms just seem to have a mind of their own. And they're going to do what they're going to do regardless of what you're trying to steer them towards. I mean, I'm not going to say that they're, so unruly that they're always going to just totally contradict what your game plan is, but sometimes they'll surprise you. So I've just been sort of picking through and jostling stuff side to side, trying to dislodge stuff from one another so that I can possibly arrive at a point where I feel comfortable that we've actually removed all of the leftover food bits and cardboard that was included in the last feeding. And it really is just down the center of the system where I would expect to find that stuff. So at this point, with the exception of this little pile over here, proven wrong, there's another little piece of something. At this point, I think we can just kind of focus on tilling up the material, stirring it around a little bit, leaving ourselves enough space on the end of the bin to establish the horizontal migration feeding zone. Here again, you can see how nice and crumbly the material is furthest away from where the feedings have been getting applied. So I think there is some value to combining the really damp stuff with some of the stuff that's not quite as damp, hopefully leveling off the moisture content throughout and taking the stuff that seems exceedingly damp and clumpy and sticky and muddy, hopefully making it into something a little bit more loose and crumbly and manageable. But it does seem to me like possibly leaving stuff uncovered here, exposed directly to the air to permit drying, is going to be the game plan here. So forget about those little pieces of bubble wrap. Well, no, that's not true. The bubble wrap will be useful for covering the feeding zone where we don't want to see drying or evaporation, because that's where we want to lure the worms to with the moisture and the foods, I guess. But I think mainly with the moisture. To me, that seems like the thing that has the tendency to convince the worms to do one thing or the other. Absence of moisture is going to make them want to go. Presence of moisture is going to want to make them stay. So I'm not sure if I can do much more in terms of stirring over here. So at this point, I'm just going to be shoving stuff over to give ourselves some space in which we can establish the horizontal migration feeding zone. There is a good bit of material in these systems. I am making a lot more space over here than I really need, so in the end we'll backfill against the little perforated cardboard divider partition that we're putting up. Obviously the holes in the cardboard are meant to permit worm traffic to pass through and ideally protect the nice finished castings from being littered with all kinds of shredded paper and cardboard and some of those other materials that we're going to be using to build the horizontal migration feeding zone. So let's see here. I'd like to do a very similar kind of thorough tilling of this other system. Oddly enough, I don't think we saw very much of the cardboard. Each of these systems had a large piece of cardboard placed in right beneath the food. And in this system here, it seems like they did away with it almost completely. Here, I saw pretty good sized chunks of the cardboard remaining. Although it is true that those couple chunks that we encountered were pieces that were sort of sticking out on the sides, not down in the material. So for those pieces to have survived the onslaught of the worm traffic, kind of makes sense because they're above the surface, they're dry. The worms are going to have no interest in anything that's dry. And I suppose as I encounter anything along the way that's not simply castings or worms, I can snatch it out and set it aside so that we can include it in the horizontal migration feeding zone. Yeah, look at all this stuff. Quite clumpy and sticky. And unfortunately not a whole lot of dry, crumbly material in this system to mix in with the damp stuff. So I'm starting to get the sense that the system I'm stirring through right now might actually take a little bit longer to get to the finish line than the other one. So until this stuff actually starts to dry off, I don't see a whole lot of migration happening. But like I said, the worms will surprise you sometimes. So that's just a guesstimate as far as what to expect here. How it plays out is anyone's guess. So I think we're almost at that point now where we've successfully gathered most, if not all, of the leftover bits of cardboard and cantaloupe that were used to feed last time. And we can proceed with the setup of the horizontal migration feeding zones and let these systems start making their way to the finish line gradually. Lots and lots of worms in these systems, you gotta admit. So for a while there, especially, I don't know, for the past month and a half, I guess, I started actually dealing with the feeding of these European night crawlers as just part of sort of a mass feeding of all my European night crawlers. So last time, even I think the title of the video, you know, referred to how we were feeding all the European night crawlers. The other European night crawler systems I have are not as old as these, and I think they've got a ways to go still before we can start thinking about migrating the worms out and harvesting their castings. Those systems still have a good bit of leafy material floating around in them and bedding materials. These systems definitely did seem like they were getting pretty close to the finish line. So here it did seem like now would be a good time to initiate the migration of the worms out of their material, and hopefully maybe by the time these systems reach 1 year of age, which is at this point 31 days away, perhaps we'll be getting close to that goal. So let's see how our little partitions fit into here. The partitions are definitely geared to allow worm traffic through. Hopefully permitting us to keep our nice finished castings clean. Now, I guess over here we had some of this leftover cardboard. These were those two pieces of cardboard that were sort of sticking out of the surface and didn't really see much wear, which makes complete sense as to why they didn't get broken down. Here I think these might have actually come from below the surface where they too survived. So this was really what I was after, was pretty good sized chunks that we can easily extract and repurpose and not leave them scattered throughout the material. So let me see here. I've got replacement top covering newspaper, but we're not going to use it. I think we are going to go down that road of leaving the surface uncovered to permit drying. So these top covering pieces of newspaper that were on here previously will go in as part of the foundation for our feeding zone, and these nice new ones that I had set aside are going to just be left out. And I guess we can come in with my prepared bedding mix here, and you know, even here we can maybe use this piece of newspaper to help protect the material from passing through that one kind of large opening that is in the cardboard over there. I mean, this doesn't have to be high precision stuff over here either, you know, so it is for the most part a best effort to keep my nice finished castings clean and not let them get contaminated with all kinds of little bits of paper and cardboard debris. So here too, I think if I just lift up this piece of paper so that it covers that gap in the cardboard, I'll be well enough protected. Okay, I think we've established a pretty decent little foundation onto which we can plop in our feeding. I'm also wondering if, I don't know, the stuff was prepared with a fair bit of fair bit of moisture when I was making that prepared bedding. And I'm surprised at how well the material soaked in all the moisture, because I thought there was even some standing water in the bottom of the plastic tub. But surprisingly, it's not quite as damp as I expected it to be. So let's see, we've got little bits of zucchini here, we've got potato peel, and more of one of the things the worms really like, more cantaloupe rind. We're going to return the leftovers to the bin too, and all these chunks of bedding material too, back down into the feeding zone. So what do we have here? Even here we've got some stems of banana peels, little bits of this and that. I'm sure some of the worms that are going along for the ride, still adhering to some of the leftover foods and bedding materials, are not going to be very thrilled about being plopped into the pile of frozen stuff over in the feeding zone, but you know what? Tough luck. I don't mean to be a heartless, mean worm farmer, so I will, try to take certain things like that into consideration, but I'm not going to bend over backwards either. So hopefully I'm not creating a terrible, uncomfortable situation for these little guys. Hopefully they can squirm away from anything they don't like. In time, the stuff will simply thaw out, lose its coldness, equalize with the temperature of all the surrounding materials. And as all that frozen stuff starts to thaw, it will also dump out a good bit of moisture down onto the bedding material that's right below it. And I'm also wondering if, maybe we can come up with a good use for this paper that I had set aside. We won't use it as a top covering out in general over the system, but I do feel like maybe it'll serve as a pretty good sort of cap to hold the moisture down. I will put the plastic coverings right over these feeding zones as well, but it does seem like using these pieces of paper in this fashion, sort of doubled up, folded over, and resting flat over the feeding zone, will also help protect the systems, or at least the material over on these sides from drying off too quickly. Maybe we can even give them a little bit more loose type stuff sprinkled out over the top to play in, just to give it a somewhat better appearance, if nothing else. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. Once we put the plastic on and the moisture begins to recirculate, hopefully the worms will manage to find their way in and out of this stuff. Although that paper does seem like a pretty good sized barrier that might prevent worm traffic from happening. So whatever, there's not a whole lot left to be done here, I think, because all I really want to do now is come up against this little cardboard partition, help prop it up, and give all the worms in this material direct access to all those little holes in the cardboard, so that they can gradually make their way over onto the side of the bin where I intend to haul them out of eventually. And then hopefully all the stuff on this side will begin drying off. It's probably best that I don't mat it down either, because all the little crevices and little openings and little gaps everywhere in between the chunks of the material should hopefully also allow for some of the moisture in the system to exit. So, man, this really took a lot longer than I thought it would. But we're pretty much done here. The only thing remaining to do is cover up and put away. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. We'll probably be checking in here to see how things are progressing. Possibly the most valuable portion of our next check-in is going to be the tilling up and the aeration of the material out here to get whatever has dried on the surface submerged, and to surface any of the more moist stuff down low up to the top, and combining the moisture content of it throughout to help further motivate the worms to leave their castings so we can harvest this stuff. So I've got a few more things I got to take care of getting put away and cleaned up around here, but I'm not going to keep you around for that. That stuff's boring. Before I go really quick though, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.